Right now, in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most powerful men in the Middle East just handed Donald Trump a message that could decide whether the world's most important oil route ever opens again. And it's not a soft message. It's not a diplomatic suggestion. It's a list. A hard, specific, non-negotiable list of demands, and Iran is saying, in plain words, until every single one of these is met, the Strait of Hormuz stays closed. If you don't know why that sentence should stop you in your tracks, stick with me for the next few minutes, because this is not just another headline about tension in the Middle East. This is about a waterway that carries roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply, a war that has been raging since February, a president who keeps threatening more strikes while his own military is quietly warning him to find a way out, and now an Iranian official standing in front of state television cameras and telling the United States exactly what it will take to end this. So let's slow down and actually understand what just happened, because the way this story is being reported in bits and pieces online makes it easy to miss just how big this moment really is. This all traces back to February of this year, when the United States and Israel launched what Trump himself called major combat operations against Iran. These were not small symbolic strikes. This was a massive, coordinated campaign hitting military sites, government buildings, and infrastructure across Iran. Somewhere inside that campaign, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was assassinated. Think about that for a second. The single most powerful man in Iran, the figure who had led the country for decades, killed in the middle of an active war with the United States and Israel. That is the kind of event that reshapes a nation's psychology, and it absolutely reshaped Iran's approach to this conflict. In response, Iran didn't fold. It didn't sue for peace. It shut the Strait of Hormuz. For those who don't follow shipping and energy markets closely, the Strait of Hormuz is arguably the single most important choke point on Earth for global trade. Roughly a quarter of the world's oil and about a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas normally moves through that narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman. When it's open, oil flows, prices stay manageable, and economies keep humming. When it's closed, or even just unstable, prices spike, shipping companies panic, and countries thousands of miles away, countries with no direct stake in this war, start feeling the pain at the gas pump. And that's exactly what happened. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps sent out warnings over radio that no ship was allowed to pass. They boarded vessels. They laid mines. They declared complete control of the strait to any ship they considered unfriendly. Since then, we've seen tugboats sunk, more than a dozen merchant ships damaged, some abandoned entirely, ships captured, and sailors killed or missing. This has not been a quiet standoff. This has been an active, violent campaign to keep one of the most vital trade routes on the planet closed. Trump's response was to try and build a coalition. At one point, he said he'd asked around 7 countries to send warships to help keep the strait open, essentially trying to build an international policing operation around Iran's blockade. The European Union even started weighing naval missions of its own. But here's the thing about trying to police a war zone with a coalition of allies who all have their own priorities. It's slow, it's expensive, and it doesn't actually solve the underlying problem, which is that Iran is not going to just let the world's oil flow through its front yard while it's being bombed. Now fast forward through months of fighting. Negotiations opened, closed, reopened. At one point, talks were happening in Doha, Qatar, described as making what Qatari officials called positive progress. Then things fell apart again. Trump, at one point, actually called off a threatened weekend strike on Iran, saying publicly that if he could give people a chance to live, he wanted to take it. He also said something that should have caught more attention than it did. He said he was under no time constraint in these negotiations because he isn't running for re-election, even though he acknowledged plenty of Republicans are, with the midterms looming in November. That's a fairly remarkable thing for a sitting president to say out loud, that his own political survival isn't the thing pushing him toward a deal, but the survival of his party might be. And the political pressure back home has been real. A CNN poll found that a striking majority of Americans, somewhere around 2/3, believe Trump's decision to go to war with Iran has actually hurt the United States. A similar majority said his broader policies have made the economy worse. That is not the kind of polling number a White House wants to see heading into a midterm election where Republicans are already fighting an uphill battle to protect a narrow House majority. Democrats, according to that same polling, currently hold a real advantage on the generic congressional ballot. So every week this war drags on without resolution. It's not just a foreign policy problem for Trump. It's a domestic political liability. Meanwhile, inside Iran, the picture has been just as brutal, maybe worse. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian gave an interview on the anniversary of his own inauguration, where he described the current period as the toughest the country has faced since the 1979 revolution. Read that carefully. Not the toughest in years, not the toughest since sanctions started, the toughest since the revolution that created the modern Islamic Republic in the first place. He talked about sanctions stacking on top of sanctions, banks getting cut off, financial systems getting strangled, and then, on top of all of that, a full-blown war. Iran has reportedly lost a massive amount of its natural gas production capacity since the war started, enough that officials have been publicly warning citizens to cut back on energy use and preparing the population for possible power outages. This is a country under enormous internal strain, and Pezeshkian himself suggested that the pressure campaign wasn't just about the war, it was designed to chip away at public support for the government itself. So both sides are hurting. Trump is watching his approval numbers slide and his party nervous about the midterms. Iran is watching its energy infrastructure crumble and its population absorb the costs of a war most of them never asked for. And into that pressure cooker, just this past week, came the moment that actually brings us to the headline you clicked on. On Saturday, Iran's national security chief, a man named Mohammad Bagher-Zolgadar, who also happens to be a commander in the powerful Revolutionary Guard, stepped forward and laid out, in explicit terms, exactly what the United States has to do before the Strait of Hormuz reopens. And this wasn't some vague statement about wanting peace. This was a list, a real itemized list of conditions. Here's what's on it. First, the United States has to lift its naval blockade around Iran. Remember, while Iran has been blockading the strait from its side, the U.S. has simultaneously been running its own naval blockade of Iranian ports. So there are actually two blockades happening at once, each side trying to choke off the other. Iran's first demand is that the American side of that equation ends completely. Second, the U.S. has to lift sanctions on Iran. This is the economic front of the war, the one that's been grinding on for years even before the shooting started. And Iran is essentially saying the financial siege has to end alongside the military one. Third, and this is a big one, the U.S. military has to withdraw from around Iran entirely. Not scale back, not reposition, withdraw. Given the scale of the American military buildup in the region since this war began, described by some as the largest U.S. military presence in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, that is an enormous ask. It's essentially demanding that Washington dismantle the entire military posture it has spent the better part of a year constructing. Fourth, Iran wants war reparations. Compensation, in other words, for the damage done to its cities, its infrastructure, and its people during months of airstrikes. Fifth, Iran wants its frozen assets released. Billions of dollars that have been locked up under sanctions regimes, money Iran says belongs to it and should be handed back as part of any resolution. And sixth, maybe the most geopolitically loaded demand of all, Iran wants the United States to end what it calls its attacks and aggression, not just against Iran itself, but against Iran's allies across the region, specifically naming Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, and Iraq. In other words, Iran isn't just negotiating for itself. It's trying to use this moment of leverage over global oil supply to negotiate on behalf of the entire network of allied groups and governments. It backs across the Middle East, the coalition sometimes referred to as the Axis of Resistance, including Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and various Iran-aligned militias in Iraq. Zolgadar didn't leave any ambiguity about how serious Iran is about this list. According to state media, he said the strait will not reopen until America corrects its behavior. He also framed these demands as coming directly from the will of the Iranian people, referencing what he described as 160 days of the public standing firm in the streets and in the field throughout this conflict. And in a separate translated statement, he made a point of saying that Iran's Supreme National Security Council will never back down, whether that's on the battlefield or at the negotiating table. Now, here's where it gets even more complicated, and this is the part a lot of headlines are glossing over. At the exact same time Iran is issuing this list of hardline demands, it's also engaged in what appear to be genuine, active negotiations with Oman over managing traffic through the strait. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, actually said publicly that discussions with Oman were approaching their final stages. Oman has been playing a critical mediating role in this entire conflict, sitting geographically right across the strait from Iran, and maintaining relationships with both Washington and Tehran that almost no other country in the region can pull off. So you've got two tracks happening simultaneously. On one track, Iran and Oman appear to be closing in on some kind of technical arrangement for how ships would actually move through the strait if and when it reopens. On the other track, Iran is telling the United States, in no uncertain terms, that the reopening itself is contingent on a much bigger, much harder political settlement, one that includes military withdrawal, reparations, and a broader ceasefire across the region. Araghchi himself basically confirmed this dual-track reality, saying that even as the technical talks with Oman move forward, the actual reopening of Hormuz still depends on other conditions, and on compensation for what Iran considers a violation of an earlier agreement. That earlier agreement matters a lot here. Back in June, the U.S. and Iran had actually signed a memorandum of understanding, a framework meant to be the foundation for a war-ending deal. But the fighting never actually stopped. Strikes continued. The naval blockade continued. And Iran's read on the situation is that the United States never lived up to what it agreed to in that memorandum in the first place. That's part of why trust between these two sides right now is basically non-existent. Iran has said, through its deputy foreign minister, that complying with the June memorandum is necessary but not sufficient. Iran wants assurances, real, enforceable assurances, that whatever deal gets made this time won't just collapse into another round of broken promises and resumed fighting. And just to show you how fragile this all still is, right around the same time all of this diplomatic maneuvering was happening, the United Arab Emirates reported that one of its ships, operated by the state oil company Adinak, was hit by what Emirati officials say was an Iranian missile while transiting the strait. One crew member was killed, 20 others were wounded. ADNOC has said that over a dozen of its vessels have now been attacked since this war began. So even as officials talk about deals approaching their final stages, the actual water where these ships are sailing is still an active combat zone. That is the tension defining this entire moment. Diplomats inching toward an agreement on paper while missiles are still flying on the water. On the American side, the reaction to Iran's list of demands has been about what you'd expect. Reporting suggests the Trump administration is unlikely to simply accept those terms wholesale. And honestly, when you actually look at the list, it's easy to understand why. Withdrawing the entire U.S. military presence from the region, paying war reparations, releasing frozen assets, and agreeing to end operations against Iran's regional allies, that's not a small ask. That's essentially Iran asking the United States to walk away from this conflict having gained nothing strategically while paying financially and militarily for having started it in the first place. From Washington's perspective, after months of framing this war as necessary to stop Iran's missile program and prevent it from ever building a nuclear weapon, simply agreeing to all of Iran's terms would look, to much of the American public and to allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia, like a stunning capitulation. But here's the other side of that coin, and it's a side that doesn't get talked about enough. Behind closed doors, there's real pressure inside the American military and political establishment to actually wind this thing down. Reports have surfaced that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, has privately told other senior Trump advisors that Washington genuinely needs to find what's being called an off-ramp from this war. That's not a small statement coming from the top uniformed officer in the entire U.S. military. There have also been reports that Trump has privately complained about disclosures regarding America's dwindling munitions stockpile, worried that revealing how depleted U.S. military supplies have become makes the country look weak at exactly the moment it needs to look strong. And even as he keeps publicly threatening additional military action to pressure Iran into a deal, that threat carries less weight if the resources to actually follow through are running low. Vice President J.D. Vance has also been candid in his own way about how difficult this process is. He's publicly acknowledged that negotiations with Iran are going to be messy and are going to take time, and he's described Iran as an extraordinarily difficult negotiating partner operating under what he called a fractured internal system. That's a pretty blunt admission from a sitting vice president, essentially conceding that even the U.S. government isn't entirely sure who inside Iran actually has the final authority to sign off on a deal, especially after the assassination of the country's supreme leader threw the internal chain of command into turmoil. And that fractured system point is worth sitting with for a second, because Iran's own parliament speaker and top negotiator has fired back at Trump directly, accusing the American side of what he called theater diplomacy. In other words, Iranian officials are publicly suggesting that Washington's talk of negotiations isn't sincere, that it's more about political optics and managing perception than about genuinely trying to reach a deal. At the same time, the two sides can't even agree on basic facts, like whether direct talks over the Strait of Hormuz are actually taking place right now or not. Washington and Tehran have literally given conflicting public accounts of whether negotiations are even happening. When two countries can't agree on whether they're talking to each other, that tells you just how deep the mistrust runs. So where does that leave us? You've got a war that has now dragged on for roughly half a year. You've got a supreme leader dead, a nation under economic siege, a natural gas crisis forcing power rationing, and a population that's been in the streets for over 160 days according to Iran's own account. On the other side, you've got a president facing plummeting approval on this specific issue, a military establishment quietly pushing for an exit, and a midterm election just months away that could reshape the balance of power in Washington. And in the middle of all of that sits the Strait of Hormuz, closed, contested, and now attached to a list of 6 hardline conditions that Iran says are non-negotiable. Global oil prices have already been driven higher by all of this instability, and everyday Americans have felt it directly at the gas pump. This isn't some abstract foreign policy story happening far away with no consequences at home. Every week this standoff continues. Energy costs ripple outward, hitting supply chains, hitting inflation, hitting the exact kind of pocketbook issues that decide elections. That's part of why this specific list of demands matters so much right now. It's not just a diplomatic sticking point between two governments. It's the single biggest variable standing between the current economic pain millions of people are feeling and any kind of relief. The big question now is whether Trump, a man who has built much of his political identity around never looking like he's backing down, is willing to accept any version of these terms, even a watered-down version negotiated through Oman as an intermediary, in exchange for finally ending a war that a majority of his own country's citizens say has already hurt the nation. Or whether he doubles down, leans on that renewed military buildup, and gambles that continued pressure will eventually force Iran to blink instead. Because, make no mistake, this is a standoff of wills as much as it is a standoff of militaries. Iran, weakened, sanctioned, having lost its supreme leader, still chose to respond to devastation with defiance, closing the world's most important oil route and effectively saying, "We would rather absorb more pain than reopen this strait on your terms." That is either the position of a government that has genuinely run out of other options and is playing its very last card, or it's the position of a government that understands exactly how much leverage a fifth of the world's oil supply gives you, even when you're losing on almost every other front. Whichever it is, the ball, as one Iranian official put it, is now sitting firmly in Trump's court. Every day that passes without an answer keeps oil markets on edge, keeps merchant sailors in genuine danger in those waters, and keeps this war, one that was supposed to be resolved by a memorandum of understanding signed back in June, dragging on with no clear end in sight. Whatever Trump decides next, whether it's more strikes, more threats, or the compromise his own military chiefs are reportedly pushing him toward, the next move belongs to him. And given everything on the table right now, that might be one of the most consequential decisions of his entire presidency. Let's talk for a moment about why this specific waterway carries so much weight, because it's easy to underestimate just how much of the modern global economy quietly depends on this one narrow channel of water. At its tightest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide, with the actual shipping lanes narrower still. Every single day, under normal conditions, dozens of massive oil tankers pass through that corridor, carrying crude bound for refineries in Asia, Europe, and beyond, and there's no easy alternative route. When this channel becomes unstable, insurance costs for shipping companies spike overnight. Tanker operators reroute vessels thousands of miles out of their way just to avoid the risk, and the ripple effects show up within days in fuel prices on the other side of the planet. Reports have documented Saudi-operated tankers diverting entirely around the African continent, adding as much as 2 weeks to their journeys, purely because the direct route has become too dangerous to risk. Multiply that kind of disruption across the scale of global shipping, and you start to understand why energy analysts and investors have been watching this specific conflict with a level of anxiety usually reserved for far larger wars. What makes this moment different from past Gulf tensions is that Iran doesn't appear to be treating the strait purely as a military choke point to be defended or attacked. It's treating it as leverage, a bargaining chip it controls, and the rest of the world desperately needs reopened. That shift in posture is exactly why Iran feels comfortable attaching such an extensive list of political demands to something as seemingly technical as shipping access. Now, let's zoom out even further and talk about the coalition of allies Iran keeps referencing in its demands, because understanding that network is essential to understanding why Iran is negotiating the way it is. When Zolkadr specifically named Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, and Iraq as places where American aggression needs to end, he wasn't picking those countries at random. Each one represents a piece of what's often called Iran's regional axis, a loose but coordinated network of allied governments, militias, and political movements that Tehran has spent decades cultivating, specifically so that it would never have to fight a war against the United States and Israel completely alone. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi movement in Yemen, which has already been directly involved in attacks on shipping in the Red Sea as part of this broader conflict, various Iran-aligned armed groups operating inside Iraq, and of course, Iran's long-standing support for Palestinian factions. By folding all of these fronts into its list of demands for reopening Hormuz, Iran is essentially saying that it doesn't see this as a bilateral war between itself and the United States at all. It sees it as one theater in a much larger regional confrontation, and it wants any resolution to address the entire map, not just the water separating Iran from Oman. That's part of why American officials have reacted the way they have. Agreeing to end operations against every single one of those allied groups would represent an enormous strategic shift, not just in this one war, but across the entire American approach to the Middle East, going back years. It would mean stepping back from confrontations with the Houthis in the Red Sea and recalibrating their relationship with Israel, which has its own active concerns about Hezbollah and Palestinian militant groups entirely apart from Iran. In other words, Iran's list isn't just asking Trump to end one war. It's effectively asking him to reorganize American strategy across half a dozen overlapping conflicts at once, all in exchange for reopening one shipping lane. That is an extraordinarily high price tag, and it's exactly why so many analysts are skeptical that Washington accepts these terms as written, at least not without months more of grinding negotiation and some significant face-saving compromise on both sides. There's also a domestic angle inside Iran that deserves more attention than it's getting. Zolgater framed these demands as coming directly from the will of the Iranian people, citing more than 160 days of public presence in the streets. That's not just political theater. Iran's government, especially after losing its supreme leader in the opening strikes of this war, has been under intense pressure to demonstrate that it hasn't been broken. Every hardline statement, every refusal to reopen the strait on anything less than full terms, serves a dual purpose. It's not just a negotiating position aimed at Washington, it's also a message aimed inward, at an Iranian public that has endured sanctions, blackouts, military strikes, and the loss of its most powerful figure in a generation. Standing firm against the United States, even at real economic cost, is partly about proving to Iranians themselves that their government hasn't buckled. That's the layer that makes predicting what happens next so genuinely difficult. If this were purely a rational cost-benefit calculation, you might expect Iran, given how badly its energy infrastructure and economy have been battered, to eventually cave and accept a partial deal just to get relief. But governments under this kind of existential pressure don't always behave that way, especially when appearing weak domestically can be just as dangerous, politically, as continuing to absorb external damage. Trump is facing something structurally similar on his end. Backing down and accepting anything that looks like it rewards Iran's list of demands risks being framed by his political opponents, and even some of his own allies, as a loss, especially with Republicans already nervous heading into a difficult midterm cycle. So you have two leaderships, each facing real internal incentives to appear tough rather than accommodating, even while both, according to reporting on the ground, are quietly looking for some kind of exit. That contradiction, public toughness paired with private searching for an off-ramp, is probably the single most important dynamic to understand if you want to know where this goes next. It's why we've seen this pattern repeat over and over throughout the year. Talks make progress, then stall, then resume, then get publicly contradicted by officials on both sides who can't even agree whether meetings are happening. It's why Trump can simultaneously threaten more strikes, while his own Joint Chiefs chairman is privately telling colleagues the country needs a way out, and why Iran's foreign minister can describe talks with Oman as nearing a final stage, while, in that same week, its national security chief publicly declares the strait won't open until America fundamentally changes its behavior. These aren't necessarily contradictions in bad faith. They're the natural byproduct of two governments trying to end a war while neither can afford to look like the side that blinked first. So what would an actual resolution realistically look like if one comes together in the coming weeks or months? Most analysts watching this closely expect that if a deal does happen, it won't be Iran's full list accepted wholesale, and it won't be a total American victory either. It's far more likely to be a staged partial arrangement, probably brokered through Oman, given its unique position as a trusted intermediary to both sides. Something like a phased reduction of the American naval presence tied to security guarantees, partial sanctions relief tied to verified steps by Iran, and a framework addressing compensation without necessarily using the word reparations. The regional demands, the parts about Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Palestine, are probably the hardest to fold into any near-term deal, and may end up getting addressed separately or left unresolved while the core shipping and military issues get settled first. But all of that is speculation built on the pattern we've seen so far, and this conflict has defied predictions more than once already. What we do know for certain is this. Right now, today, the Strait of Hormuz remains a flashpoint. Ships are still getting hit, sailors are still getting hurt, oil markets are still on edge, and the President of the United States now has, in writing, a specific, detailed list of exactly what it would take, according to Iran, to bring this particular chapter of the war to a close. What he does with that list, whether he treats it as an opening position to negotiate down, a wish list to reject outright, or something in between, will shape not just this conflict, but American credibility across the entire region for years to come. We'll be tracking exactly what happens next as this story develops, because the direction this goes could very well shape oil prices, the midterm elections, and the balance of power across the entire Middle East for years to come.